I woke that morning with my suit already pressed, the courthouse papers laid neatly on the kitchen table. My hands shook as I tied the same dark tie I wore at my son's wedding. Back then, it had been a symbol of pride. Today, it felt like a chain around my neck. I told myself this hearing was only a formality, that truth would speak louder than lies. But deep down, a voice whispered that my family's silence would echo louder than any verdict. Have you ever stood in a room full of people you loved and wondered if even one of them would speak up for you? Tell me below. Your answers will stay with me as this story unfolds. I stepped through the courthouse doors and saw her, my daughter-in-law, already waiting with her lawyer. She smiled, a sharp smile meant not for warmth, but for victory. That was the moment I understood. This day would not be about truth. It would be about survival. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old dust, the kind of air that clings to records kept longer than memories. My steps slowed as I crossed the marble floor, though every sound echoed back at me like a reminder that I could not turn away. The benches were half filled with strangers, their heads already bowed into their phones, uninterested in the battle about to unfold. But for me, every second tightened the rope inside my chest. I had come expecting justice. Now I wondered if I had only walked into an ambush. My daughter-in-law looked radiant in the way only someone convinced of their own victory can look. She held a folder close to her chest, whispering into her lawyer's ear with a kind of ease that unnerved me. The smile she flashed my way was not meant for greeting. It was a warning, a small rehearsal for what she planned to deliver. My son wasn't beside her. His absence burned deeper than the smile. Perhaps that was her first win, to silence him before I could even hear his "see." Damned. The clerk called my name, and I rose like a man summoned to his own sentencing. Every eye in the room seemed to land on me, though most would forget me by noon. That's the cruelty of these hearings. They turn private betrayals into public theater, and once the curtain falls, the audience walks away untouched. I, however, would carry the scene long after the judge's gavel. When the proceedings began, her lawyer moved swiftly, laying out papers, photos, and printed messages as though they were sacred texts. Each page turned was another blow to my chest. He spoke with confidence, weaving a story of misconduct, neglect, and dishonesty. But what struck me hardest was not his tone. It was the fact that my daughter-in-law sat there nodding, pretending that every word had come from her lived truth. She wasn't only lying, she was performing, and she had rehearsed this act well. I wanted to object, to stand and shout that it was false, but my lawyer pressed a steady hand on my arm. "Wait," he whispered. His voice carried the calm of someone who trusted the process. I envied his faith. Mine had long since worn thin. Then came the messages. She claimed they were mine, text after text filled with threats, admissions, and promises I had never made. Each one crafted to paint me as a man unworthy of trust. I leaned forward, staring at the words, hoping to recognize something, anything that tied them to me. But they were strangers, sentences I had never typed, phrases that did not belong to my voice. My throat tightened. How do you fight against evidence you never created? How do you prove a ghost is not your own reflection? The judge scanned the papers with a kind of heavy patience. He did not rush. He weighed each page like it carried more than ink, and for a moment I thought he might believe her. My stomach churned at the thought of my dignity slipping through his hands, traded for the lies she crafted in her living room. I caught her glance again. This time her smile had grown into something bolder, almost triumphant. It was as if she could already see me condemned. That was when I remembered something I had once told my son. Truth doesn't vanish just because someone hides it. I held on to that thought like a lifeline, even as the papers stacked higher on the desk. The judge finally raised a brow and turned toward her. "These messages," he said, his voice measured, "came from your account?" The question was sharp, direct, and for the first time all morning, her smile faltered. She adjusted in her seat, clearing her throat. "They were forwarded to me," she replied, her lawyer stepping in quickly to smooth over the hesitation. But I caught it, that split second where her performance cracked. and I knew the judge caught it too. The courtroom air shifted. People who had been uninterested began to glance up. The weight of the lies had bent, even if it hadn't yet broken. I sat still, breathing quietly, because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is waiting for the truth to catch up. The pause after her hesitation stretched longer than anyone expected. It wasn't silence in the ordinary sense. It was the kind that draws every breath, every shuffle of paper, into sharper focus. The judge leaned back slightly, as if giving her space to repeat herself, but the damage had been done. Even a practiced liar knows that timing matters, and her stumble had left a crack in the performance. Didn't smile. I didn't dare. If I let even the smallest trace of satisfaction cross my face, she would recover and paint me as smug, as manipulative. Instead, I lowered my eyes to the table the way a man does when he is steadying himself for a storm. Inside, though, I felt the faintest flicker of something I hadn't carried into this room. Hope. Her lawyer recovered quickly, guiding her through explanations that sounded rehearsed but shaky. He spoke of forwarded messages, of evidence preserved, but none of his words could erase that instant of doubt that had hung in the air. The judge asked for clarification, his tone patient but firm, and each time the answers seemed thinner than the last. I sat back, listening. For years I had been accused of speaking too quickly, of defending myself before anyone had even finished the charge. Age had taught me that silence is often the sharper weapon. That day I sharpened it as best I could. My lawyer finally stood, and his voice cut through the room with a steady calm. He pointed out that the supposed messages lacked certain markers, timestamps inconsistent with phone records, phrases that didn't match my usual speech. He even produced a witness from my side, a family friend who testified that on one of the nights these messages were allegedly sent, I was sitting at his table playing cards. The weight shifted further. What had seemed solid began to sound brittle, and the judge's eyes, though careful, betrayed a spark of curiosity. Still, I could feel my daughter-in-law watching me, her posture straight, her chin high. She wasn't broken, not yet. People like her rarely surrender in one blow. They double down, finding new angles, new weapons. And sure enough, she leaned into a narrative that reached beyond the printed texts. She spoke of conversations, of looks, of patterns of behavior that could not be captured on a screen. She painted me as controlling, distant, a man who had long ago abandoned the bonds of family. Those words struck deeper than the forgeries, because while the messages were lies, the accusations carried shadows of truth. Had I been distant? Had I spoken sharply in moments of anger? Yes, I had. And now, in this room, those fragments of reality gave her lies the power they needed. That was the danger of family conflict. It was never just about facts. It was about feelings carried through years, about grudges passed like heirlooms, about silences that stretched into judgments, and I could not erase those with evidence alone. The judge didn't interrupt her. He let her speak, perhaps to see how far she would stretch the story. I watched carefully, searching for the point where embellishment would turn into overreach. And when it came, it was almost invisible. A single claim that contradicted the very documents she had submitted. Her lawyer flinched. The judge scribbled a note. That was when I felt the tide shift again, not as a flood but as a quiet change in current. The case wasn't over. I wasn't safe, but for the first time, the lies no longer felt unshakable. The judge's pen scratched against the notepad, his eyes still fixed on her. That hesitation, that small slip from part 2, had shifted the balance slightly in my favor, but the air in the courtroom was far from settled. A battle of facts could be weighed on paper, but the war of family loyalty played out in silence, and it was my son's silence that weighed heavier than any accusation. He sat 2 rows behind her, not at the counsel's table, but close enough to show where his allegiance leaned. He hadn't spoken since I entered the room, not even a nod in my direction. The boy I once taught to ride a bike, the man I helped through college, sat still, his arms crossed tightly as though protecting himself from both of us. I couldn't help but wonder, was his silence a sign of doubt, or had he already chosen her side? That uncertainty gnawed at me more than the false evidence. Lies you can disprove. Silence is harder to fight. When the judge called for a short recess, the room spilled into quiet chatter. Lawyers leaned close to their clients, papers shuffled, and strangers stretched their legs. I stayed seated, my eyes on the wooden floor. That's when I felt his shadow approach. "Dad," he said, low enough so no one else could hear. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed. I looked up, hoping for some trace of the boy I once knew. Instead, I saw hesitation buried under duty. "You should think about settling," he whispered. "This is only going to get worse." The words struck harder than any accusation. He didn't ask if I was innocent. He didn't ask if I was all right. He had already accepted her version of the story. "Is that her advice or yours?" I asked quietly. He blinked, caught between loyalty and fear. "It doesn't matter. Just think about it." And with that, he stepped back, returning to her side before I could press further. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the bench. This was no longer just about court. It was about blood turning its back on me, about years of effort and sacrifice evaporating in one whispered suggestion. When the hearing resumed, my focus was split. I heard the lawyers spar. I saw the judge's careful expression, but beneath it all ran a deeper ache. How could a son stand by while his father was torn apart? Had I failed him somewhere along the way? Had I taught him loyalty only to see it turned against me? Her lawyer pressed harder, sensing the cracks in my family bond were as valuable as the forged messages. He emphasized estrangement, distance, patterns of neglect. Each word seemed designed not just to sway the judge, but to remind my son of every disappointment he might have carried silently. And perhaps that was the cruelest tactic, because in family disputes, truth becomes tangled with memory. The courtroom wasn't just a stage for evidence. It was a mirror, forcing each of us to confront what we wanted to believe. I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because anything I spoke in anger would confirm the image she painted. My silence was both shield and prison. The judge finally called for a longer break, adjourning until after lunch. As I stood, my knees stiff from hours of sitting, I caught one last glance from my son. There was no hatred there, no victory, only weariness. He looked like a man trapped between two fires, too afraid to step into either. And that was when I realized the trial wasn't just against her lies. It was against the fractures in my own family, and those wounds cut deeper than any forged text message ever could. Lunch recess turned the courthouse into a swarm of hurried footsteps, muffled conversations, and the faint clatter of vending machines echoing through the halls. I stayed seated longer than most, unwilling to face the hallway where I knew whispers would follow me. But eventually, I stood, collecting the folder I barely looked at anymore. Evidence mattered, yes, but what mattered more now was how much ground she had already gained by pulling my son closer. I stepped into the corridor, and there she was. She stood near the water fountain, speaking quietly into her phone, her back straight, her tone calm, almost businesslike. For someone who had accused me of cruelty, she carried herself as though she were the injured one, perfectly composed. When she noticed me, she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, small and sharp, then slipped her phone into her purse. "Still fighting?" she asked. Her voice wasn't mocking. It was flat, calculated, like someone commenting on the weather. I looked at her, tired of the mask she wore. "I'll fight until the lies stop." Her smile widened slightly. "Then you'll never stop fighting." That was the first crack. She wasn't speaking as a victim. She was speaking as someone who intended to drag this on until I broke. I thought about walking away, but something in me pushed back. "Does it ever bother you?" I asked. "That you've built this case on things you know aren't real?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing just enough to reveal what she was holding in. "Truth is whatever the judge believes." And right now, he's listening to me. Her confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was strategy. She believed control was already hers. And maybe it was, at least until she slipped again. From behind us, I heard my son's footsteps. He approached with his hands in his pockets, trying to look like a man caught in the middle when really he was drifting to her side. He stopped between us, avoiding my eyes. "We should head outside," he said quietly. "Get some air before we go back in." She linked her arm with his, a gesture so casual it looked rehearsed. But when she glanced at me, I caught it. The faint tension in her jaw, the way she held him just a little too tightly. That wasn't affection. That was possession. As they walked toward the doors, I followed at a distance. Watching them, I began to notice what the courtroom's formality had hidden. His shoulders slumped when she leaned close. His replies were short, often just nods or a quick, "Yeah." It wasn't the posture of a man in love. It was the posture of a man worn down. We reached the courtyard outside. The autumn air carried the smell of rain on concrete, sharp and heavy. They found a bench and I stayed near the wall, far enough not to intrude but close enough to listen. She talked. She always talked. Her hands moved as she spoke, firm, decisive gestures as though she were giving instructions instead of sharing thoughts. He listened, rubbing his temples now and then, nodding at the right moments. And then it happened. She said something. I couldn't hear the words, but his reaction shifted. He pulled his arm away from her grip, just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to show resistance. It was small, but it was there. I realized then that their marriage wasn't as solid as she wanted the world to see. The control she had was strong, yes, but it was also fragile, built on constant pressure. Remove that pressure and the cracks might widen. When she noticed his pullback, her smile faltered. She reached for his hand again, this time holding it tighter, her voice dropping lower. He didn't resist, but he didn't look at her either. His gaze drifted across the courtyard, empty, tired. That was my opening, though I didn't use it aloud. I filed it away, a truth stronger than any exhibit my lawyer could wave around. If her grip on him was slipping in small, unnoticed ways, then time was my ally. The bell rang through the courthouse, calling everyone back. They rose, and once again she led the way while he followed. But now I followed with a different mind. The trial was still raging, yes, but I had just seen something more valuable than a ruling. I had seen that she was not untouchable. Inside, the courtroom filled again. She straightened her papers, ready to keep building her wall of accusations. But all I could think about was the moment outside when my son pulled away. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first sign that her power over him wasn't absolute. And in that realization, my resolve deepened. She could bend facts, she could twist narratives, but cracks had already started to show in the one place she thought she was strongest. If I held steady, those cracks would grow. The afternoon session started slower than the morning. The judge looked weary, the attorneys shuffled papers with less urgency, and even the audience seemed quieter. But beneath that calm, tension ran deeper than ever. What had happened outside wasn't just a small moment to me. It was proof. Proof that she wasn't unshakable, that my son wasn't as lost as I feared. Still, proof in my mind wasn't enough. This room demanded something visible, something undeniable. Her lawyer called the next witness, a neighbor from my street. She stepped up nervously, glancing between me and my son. I had known her for years, exchanged small talk at mailboxes, shared polite nods across driveways, yet now she was being asked questions designed to paint me as someone I didn't recognize. "Did you ever hear raised voices coming from his home?" the lawyer asked. The neighbor shifted. "Yes, sometimes. Mostly arguments." Arguments? Of course there had been arguments. No family is free from them. But the way the lawyer framed it, the way she glanced at my son as though to say, "See?" Others noticed, too, cut deeper than it should have. When my attorney cross-examined, he asked simple things. "Did you ever see physical harm? Did you ever witness threats?" She shook her head each time, but the damage was done. A seed had been planted, and she knew it. That's how lies worked. They didn't need to be whole stories. They just needed enough fragments to sound real. I sat through it, my hands clasped tightly, and watched my son. He leaned forward during her testimony, listening intently, but when she admitted she never saw anything, his posture sagged. He looked conflicted. That was the second crack. When the neighbor left, her lawyer brought in text messages, printouts stacked on the desk like bricks. She held them high as if they were irrefutable truth. These are messages where he refuses to let his son move out, where he pressures him to stay close. Look at the tone, controlling, manipulative. They passed the pages forward. The judge skimmed, my attorney skimmed, and then I did. They weren't wrong. I had begged my son not to move so far, not to cut me off, not to give all his time to her. The words looked harsher in black and white, stripped of the fear and loneliness behind them. My attorney leaned to me. We can argue context, but the words are tough. You'll have to speak on this yourself. I nodded, my throat dry. Speaking was never the problem. The problem was knowing if he'd believe me. When I was called to the stand, the weight of every eye pressed against me. I took the oath, sat, and faced the questions. My attorney asked first. Why did you send those messages? Because I was afraid, I answered honestly. Afraid of losing my son. Afraid she would turn him against me completely. I didn't use the right words, but I wasn't trying to control him. I was trying to keep my family from breaking apart. Silence followed. For once, no one shuffled papers. No one coughed. I looked at the judge, then at my son. He didn't look away. He just stared, his brow furrowed, his jaw tight. Her lawyer rose. So you admit you pressured him. You admit you couldn't let him live his own life. I admit I was scared, I said again. Parents aren't perfect. We make mistakes. But fear is not the same as cruelty. Wanting my son in my life is not abuse. My voice wavered, but didn't break. The lawyer pressed again, circling the same points, but I kept steady. Then something shifted. My son leaned back, crossed his arms, and frowned, not at me, but at her lawyer. He wasn't nodding along anymore. He wasn't quietly agreeing with every accusation. That was the third crack. The session ended late in the day, the judge calling it adjourned until tomorrow. Papers were packed, chairs pushed back, and people filed out. I stayed seated, drained but certain I had given something real that couldn't be twisted so easily. As I stood, I caught my son hesitating by the aisle. He looked at me, just briefly, then glanced at her. She tugged his arm, impatient, wanting to leave. He didn't move right away. That hesitation was small, barely noticeable to anyone else, but I saw it. Walking out into the fading light, I understood something. Court was a battlefield, yes, but the true fight wasn't only in evidence or witnesses. It was in the quiet spaces, the in-between moments, where truth revealed itself not in grand speeches but in tiny fractures, and those fractures were growing. The next morning carried a kind of weight I hadn't felt before. Each day in that courthouse had taken something from me, sleep, strength, even appetite. But this morning felt different. It wasn't dread anymore. It was something closer to resolve. The cracks I had seen in my son's face the day before were enough to remind me that nothing was decided yet. And sometimes, small cracks grow into breaks no one can patch over. The courtroom filled more slowly that day, as if everyone sensed the pace was about to change. I sat in my place, hands folded, waiting for what came next. She was already there, whispering sharply to her lawyer. The sharpness wasn't hidden anymore. Even from where I sat, I could see the frustration etched in her movements. She wanted this over. She wanted control. But control was starting to slip. Her lawyer stood, her voice steady but her arguments circling familiar ground. My supposed neglect, my supposed bitterness, my supposed inability to let go. She produced receipts, calendars, even photographs meant to imply I was inconsistent, unreliable. Each item was explained with certainty, as if certainty itself could build truth. Yet certainty, when stretched too thin, becomes fragile. My attorney pushed back. not loudly but firmly. He pointed out gaps in timelines, asked why some documents appeared only now, why details in her testimony shifted from one version to another. Each question lingered in the air longer than it should have, and each answer came with hesitation. It wasn't just me noticing. The judge's brow furrowed more often. My son, who had once sat with his body angled toward her, now leaned back, watching more than agreeing. He no longer nodded when she spoke. He no longer reached for her hand under the table. And then came the moment that changed everything. My attorney asked about a bank transfer, money withdrawn in my son's name but moved into an account only she controlled. Her lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the line of questioning. Papers were handed across, numbers highlighted, dates circled. She tried to explain. She said it was for bills, for savings, for family planning. But the numbers didn't match. The transfers were larger than bills, irregular, always timed to moments when arguments between her and my son had been sharpest. My son's eyes widened as the papers reached him. He read them once, twice, then turned to her. His lips parted like he wanted to ask a question, but no words came out. She avoided his stare. For the first time, she didn't meet his eyes. That silence between them said more than testimony ever could. I watched quietly, my heart pounding, but my face calm. This wasn't triumph. It was something heavier. To see her story unravel meant seeing my son's trust shatter too. And though it had been her choice, her lies, he was the one left standing in the rubble of betrayal. The session moved forward, but everything had shifted. Witnesses who followed seemed less convincing. Her lawyer's questions grew more defensive, less certain. My son's silence stretched on, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him rather than the woman beside him. When recess came, the hallway buzzed with murmurs. People whispered about the account, about her hesitation, about the look on my son's face. She stormed past me without a word, her heels striking the floor like hammers. My son trailed behind more slowly, still holding the papers, his shoulders heavy. I didn't approach him. I wanted to, but this wasn't the time. Trust broken once is delicate, and pushing too soon can feel like another betrayal. Instead, I sat alone on the bench, watching him wrestle with the weight of truth he hadn't expected. It's strange how long silence can last in a noisy building. For nearly 10 minutes, the hallway moved around us, people coming and going, voices rising and falling, but between us, only silence. Finally, he spoke, not to me, but loud enough for me to hear. Why didn't she tell me? He wasn't asking me. He wasn't asking anyone. He was asking the question that lives at the heart of every betrayal. Why does someone you trust choose lies instead of truth? He didn't wait for an answer, because there wasn't one, not one that could make sense of what he had seen. When court resumed, she tried to recover. She spoke of sacrifices, of choices made for the good of the household. She wrapped her words in reason, but the weight of evidence dragged them down. My son didn't defend her this time. He didn't lean toward her. He didn't whisper support. He sat apart, his face pale, his hand resting on the table as if steadying himself. I should have felt vindicated. Maybe a part of me did. But stronger than that was something else. Grief. Grief for the marriage cracking before my eyes. Grief for the man my son wanted to be. Grief for the years wasted under someone else's control. The hearing ended with no final decision yet. The judge postponed, saying more review was needed. But decisions weren't the only things that mattered in court. Perceptions mattered. Trust mattered. And those had already shifted. As I walked out, I knew tomorrow would bring more battles, more words, more digging into painful truths. But today, something had already changed. She no longer held the story in her hands. It had slipped through her fingers, and my son had seen it happen. And once you see a story crack apart, you can't unsee it. That night after court, I sat at the kitchen table staring at a half-empty cup of tea. It had gone cold, untouched, but I hadn't noticed until the hour grew late. The day's events kept replaying. her hands clutching at explanations, his silence that cut sharper than any words. It was the silence that haunted me most, because silence often carries truths louder than anger ever could. When morning came, I wondered if he would even show up in court again. Part of me expected him to walk away, too ashamed or too broken to face more unraveling. But he came. He walked in alone, carrying himself with that same heaviness, but with something new. Distance. He didn't sit beside her immediately. He took his seat a step apart, as though even closeness had become unbearable. The judge noticed, everyone noticed, and though no one said it aloud, the shift was felt. Her lawyer tried to regain ground, questioning witnesses who might defend her character, painting her as misunderstood, as a woman under pressure, as someone who had done what she thought necessary. But every sentence felt thinner now, stretched too far over cracks already exposed. Then my attorney asked the question I had feared and hoped for all at once. Can we submit into evidence the messages recovered from her phone? A murmur rolled across the room. She stiffened, her lips parting in a small, sharp gasp. Her lawyer objected, but the objection was overruled. The judge received the stack of papers, screenshots, records, conversations captured and printed. He read silently at first, then aloud when the content mattered. Words filled the air, her words, typed in confidence and cruelty, assuming they would never be seen beyond the glow of a small screen. There were messages where she mocked me, where she strategized how to paint me as unfit, where she bragged about how easily my son believed her. Each sentence landed like a stone, not on me. I had already felt the sting of betrayal, but on my son. He sat frozen, his face pale, his hand gripping the armrest so tightly I thought it might break. When the judge read the line, "He'll never see it coming. Old men are easy to break," my son lowered his head into his hands. That was the moment the last of his belief shattered. I sat still, my breath steady, though my chest ached. It wasn't victory. It was devastation laid bare for everyone to witness. She tried to explain again. She said the messages were taken out of context, that they were jokes, that she had been venting, but the words betrayed her more than any witness ever could. Jokes don't sound like strategy. Venting doesn't look like cruelty dressed as confidence. The courtroom air grew heavy. No one leaned forward to listen anymore. They recoiled, as if not wanting to be too close to the wreckage of a collapsing facade. During recess, he didn't follow her this time. He walked out on his own, pacing in the hallway, one hand running through his hair, the other still holding those papers. I followed more slowly, giving him distance until finally he turned toward me. His eyes were red, not from anger, but from grief. "Dad," he said, voice cracking, "I don't know who I married." I wanted to reach out, to place my hand on his shoulder, but I hesitated. This wasn't a wound a touch could heal. So instead, I spoke quietly. Sometimes we only learn who people are when truth strips the mask away. He looked at me for a long time, searching my face for judgment, for anger, for something sharp he could brace against. But I gave him none of that. I only gave him what I had left: honesty. "She made you doubt me," I said, steady but not harsh. "But now you've seen for yourself." He nodded slowly, the weight of acknowledgement pressing down on him. "I believed her," he whispered. "I believed everything." "You wanted to," I answered, "because you loved her. That's not weakness. That's trust. And trust is never shameful. It's the betrayal of it that is." His lips trembled as he pressed them together, and then he turned away, pacing again, holding his own guilt like a chain he couldn't set down. Back inside, the tone shifted entirely. Her voice cracked under questioning now. Her lawyer looked exhausted, flipping through notes that no longer carried weight. Even the judge seemed less patient, less tolerant of excuses. By the time the day ended, her defense was paper-thin, her credibility in ruins. The judge postponed again, saying more deliberation was needed, but in truth, the decision had already been made in the hearts of those who mattered most: my son, and perhaps even the judge himself. When I left the courthouse, I didn't feel lighter. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time I felt the ground tilting back in my direction. Her lies were no longer the only story being told. And sometimes, truth doesn't roar. It chips away, slow and steady, until the walls of deception collapse under their own weight. The days that followed were strange, suspended between relief and unease. On the surface, her case was cracking wide open. But something inside me refused to celebrate too early. Betrayal like hers had taught me to be cautious, to keep watch even when it seemed the storm had passed. My son had seen her messages with his own eyes, yet I wondered, was it enough to truly sever the hold she had over him? Or would he find ways to excuse it, to soften what was plain? That question stayed with me when court resumed. She entered differently this time. Her confidence had thinned, her shoulders tighter, her gaze darting instead of steady. But she still tried. She adjusted her clothes carefully, held her chin higher than her heart could bear, and leaned into a posture of defiance. People who build their lives on control rarely surrender it without a fight. Her lawyer began with a new strategy: to attack my credibility. They called into question my age, my health, even my memory. They suggested that I had misinterpreted her intentions, that perhaps my distrust of her had clouded judgment long before this trial began. I sat quietly, letting them talk, my hands folded on the table. It wasn't the first time I'd been underestimated. I had lived long enough to know that silence can be its own testimony. Then my attorney called me to the stand again. The courtroom hushed. He asked me simple, deliberate questions. Did I pressure her? Did I ever deny her a fair place in my home? Did I fabricate the records? I answered each one steadily, never rushing, never embellishing. The truth does not need decoration. It only needs consistency. And as I spoke, I watched my son. He didn't look away this time. He didn't shield her with his eyes. He listened, really listened, as though for the first time he was hearing not just my words, but the years behind them. Her lawyer tried to rattle me. They brought up minor disagreements, tried to twist old conversations into something heavy. But the more they pressed, the clearer it became that they had little left. Their questions leaned on shadows, while the evidence of her own words stood in daylight. Still, she fought. When she took the stand, she painted herself as the victim. She spoke of stress, of feeling cornered, of being judged harshly. She cried. Real tears or not, I couldn't tell, but they rolled freely. She reached for my son's gaze, begging silently for sympathy. And for a moment, I thought he might give it. His hands fidgeted, his jaw clenched, his body leaning forward as though caught between instinct and reason. But then his eyes fell on those printed messages resting on the table. He didn't move closer. He stayed back. Her story stumbled. Under cross-examination, she contradicted herself. Details didn't line up. What had once been sharp answers now blurred with hesitation. The courtroom felt it too. That subtle shift when confidence erodes, when the narrative no longer holds. By the time she stepped down, the tension in the room had changed. Not entirely gone, but different, weighted less by fear and more by inevitability. During a short break, my son approached me. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood near, as though testing whether standing beside me would feel wrong. It didn't. He let out a breath, heavy and uneven. "Dad," he said, his voice low so only I could hear. "I see it now. All of it." I studied him carefully. His face carried shame, yes, but also awakening. He wasn't fully free yet, but he was breaking through. "She fooled me," he admitted, the words dragging as though they resisted being spoken. "She wanted to," I replied, "because if she could keep you against me, she could win everything." He shook his head slowly. "I thought I was protecting her. I thought you were the problem. And now I feel like a fool." I placed my hand on his shoulder, this time without hesitation. "You're not a fool. You were a husband who trusted. That's not weakness. The mistake was hers, not yours." His throat worked as he swallowed hard, and for the first time since this began, I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen for months. Resolve. When court resumed, her lawyer attempted one last desperate motion. They argued that the messages were misinterpreted, that tone is impossible to capture in writing, that context was missing. But even as they spoke, their words felt brittle. No one leaned forward anymore. Even the judge listened with the patience of someone waiting for the obvious to conclude. The day ended without a ruling, but the outcome was becoming clearer with every session. The walls she had built were falling, not by my hand alone, but by the weight of her own words collapsing inward. That evening, my son came to my house. He didn't bring her. He didn't mention her. He simply sat with me at the same table where, weeks earlier, I had stared into a cold cup of tea. This time, he poured the tea himself. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Sometimes silence can mend what words have broken. But before he left, he turned to me and said, "When this is over, I need to make it right with you. I don't know how yet, but I will." And I believed him, because for the first time in a long while, his words carried the weight of truth. The night before the judge was expected to deliver a ruling, I hardly slept. The house was quiet, yet my thoughts moved restlessly. Every shadow on the wall felt like a reminder of what had been risked: my family, my name, the years of work I'd spent building something I thought would last. I had stood firm, but still there was the question that lingered. Would truth hold weight in that courtroom, or would her performance win out? Mornings, G came, sharp and unkind. My son arrived at my door earlier than usual. His face showed the lines of someone who hadn't rested either. He carried no papers, no defenses, only himself. When he stepped inside, I noticed the absence of her presence immediately. She was nowhere near, and for the first time in weeks, the air around him wasn't heavy with her influence. We didn't talk much on the drive to court. The silence wasn't strained, though. It was more like a truce, both of us gathering what strength we had left for the hours ahead. When we entered the courtroom, she was already there. She sat upright, her hands folded neatly on the table, her lawyer whispering close to her ear, but there was a nervous flicker in her eyes that betrayed the calm posture she tried to maintain. She knew as well as we did that the evidence had cut deeper than any excuse could mend. The judge began with a steady tone, reviewing the case, point by point. His words were measured, not rushed. Every detail mattered. He spoke about the financial inconsistencies, the testimony, and finally, the messages, her own words, preserved in black and white, leaving little room for reinterpretation. I could feel the room tighten as he paused. Her lawyer shifted, adjusting papers that no longer seemed useful. She clasped her hands tighter, the tips of her fingers pale. My son stared at the floor as though bracing himself for impact. The ruling came slowly, but firmly. The court recognized her behavior as manipulative and dishonest. The claims she had raised were dismissed. The records she had altered were condemned as fabrications, and her standing in the case, what she thought would give her leverage, was stripped down to almost nothing. I exhaled, not with triumph, but with release. It was over. Not entirely, but the sharpest edge of it had been blunted. She didn't look at me when the judge left the bench. Instead, she turned to my son with a desperate expression, a silent plea. He didn't move toward her. He stayed seated, his shoulders squared, his gaze unflinching. Whatever bond she had tightened around him was loosening for good. When we stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter, though still charged with the aftershock of everything that had unfolded. Reporters hovered nearby, but we kept walking, ignoring the noise. My son slowed, then stopped at the steps. He rubbed his hands over his face as though trying to wipe away the months that had weighed on him. "I can't believe it," he muttered. "You believed her," I said quietly. He dropped his hands and met my eyes. "I know, and that's what hurts most." "It hurts because you cared," I told him. "And caring is never the mistake. Trusting the wrong person is." He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something steady in him, not confusion, not guilt, but clarity. That evening, the house didn't feel as empty as it had in the weeks before. My son stayed. We shared a meal, nothing elaborate, just food on the table and the comfort of presence. He asked me questions about old family stories, about how I had managed certain hardships in the past. He listened in a way he hadn't done since he was young. I realized then that the real victory wasn't in the courtroom, but in the rebuilding that began quietly at home. Paperwork could dismiss her lies, but only time and patience could restore what she had tried to destroy between us. Still, a part of me remained cautious. I knew her type. People like her rarely disappeared without trying to claw back what they lost. I could already imagine the ways she might attempt to return, through appeals, through whispers, through manipulation outside of legal walls. The battle was won, but the war might not yet be over. And so I chose to stay alert, not out of fear, but out of wisdom earned. I had walked through fire with my own son standing on the other side. Now he was walking back toward me. That was worth every sleepless night, every doubt, every bitter word in that courtroom. The future wasn't spotless, but it was ours again. After the ruling, life didn't return to normal overnight. How could it? Trust isn't a switch you flip back on. It's a rope that has to be restrung knot by knot until it can hold weight again. My son and I were still careful with each other, moving around conversations like they might collapse beneath us. But slowly, the silences became less heavy, and the meals together turned into more than obligation. They became choice. The first time he came by without calling ahead, I knew something had changed. He walked in carrying a bag of groceries, unasked, and placed them on the kitchen counter. He didn't make a speech or explanation, just started chopping onions like it had always been his habit. It struck me in that moment that the battle wasn't just about exposing her. It was about giving him space to find his way back without shame. I thought often about the question I had asked at the start of all this. How does a man keep his dignity when those closest to him turn against him? The answer, I realized, wasn't in striking harder or proving worth to people unwilling to see it. It was in standing steady even when the people you love falter. Her presence didn't vanish completely. Word got back to me through neighbors, through whispers at the market. She had tried speaking badly of me, spinning stories to anyone who would listen. At first I felt the familiar heat rising in me, the urge to defend, to counter every lie. But then I asked myself, what does her voice matter if my son has finally begun to hear mine? That silence was the greatest defense I could hold. One Sunday, months after the trial, we sat outside on the porch together. The sun was dipping low and he turned to me and said, "Dad, I should have known better." His voice cracked a little, like the words carried more weight than he could comfortably bear. I looked at him, really looked, at the man he had become, older than I was when I first held him as a baby, yet still searching for solid ground. "You trusted," I said. "That's not a failure. That's proof of your heart." He nodded, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not guilt, not fear, just respect. That was the gift I hadn't expected to find at this stage in life. Not victory over an enemy, but recognition from the son I thought I had lost. With time, the house grew warmer again. Not because of furniture or new paint, but because laughter started finding its way back inside. My grandchildren visited more often, and I noticed how carefully my son guided them through the rooms, as though he wanted them to feel at home here, safe. Still, I kept the papers from the case in a drawer in my study, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. A reminder that strength isn't about avoiding betrayal. It's about refusing to let betrayal write your ending. I sometimes wonder if she'll try again, in some other way, in some other season. Maybe she will. But the difference now is that I don't face her alone. My son stands beside me, and together we've learned what it means to guard not just property or name, but the bond between father and son. So if you ask me now, was the fight worth it? I'd say yes, though not for the reasons I once believed. Not for the pride, not even for the justice. It was worth it because through the fire, I found a way to rebuild what mattered most. Saint. And maybe that's the lesson I leave behind. You can't stop people from betraying you, but you can stop them from defining you. Dignity isn't granted by others. It's something you carry even when the world tries to strip it away. Even after the dust settled, I found myself circling back to small moments that had been overshadowed during the storm. It wasn't just about her lies or the courtroom battle. It was about how close we came to unraveling completely as a family. Some nights, lying awake in the quiet, I wondered, if the judge hadn't read those messages, if the truth had stayed buried, what would have become of us? Would my son have walked away from me forever, convinced of things I never did? That thought stayed with me like a stone in my pocket, always there, weighing just enough to remind me of how fragile trust can be. And maybe that's why I couldn't shake the feeling that her chapter wasn't fully closed. I didn't say this to my son. He needed peace, not more warnings. But in my gut, I sensed she wasn't done. When he started bringing the children more often, I noticed they seemed more relaxed here, freer. They laughed in the backyard, ran through the house without hesitation, and I couldn't help but think how different it must feel from the tension they carried before. That gave me hope, but also worry. If she saw them rebuilding bonds here, would that fuel her bitterness? I didn't have to wait long for my answer. One evening, after dinner, my son showed me a message he'd received. It was from her. Short, sharp, designed to cut. "You think he's innocent now, but you'll see the truth soon." He looked at me across the table, eyes clouded with something between anger and fear. I told him calmly, "She wants to rattle you, that's all." But inside, I knew this was the start of another round, a different kind of fight. One fought not in court, but in the quieter spaces of doubt and loyalty. It tested us again. He began asking questions in small ways, about the past, about decisions I'd made years ago. Not accusations, but enough to let me know her words were crawling into his mind. I answered each question with patience, not defensiveness. If I had learned anything, it was that raising my voice only gave more power to her lies. What struck me most was how the children began noticing the tension. One of them asked, "Grandpa, why does Mom say mean things about you?" My heart clenched, but I forced myself to smile gently and say, "Sometimes people are hurt, and when they're hurt, they say things that aren't true. But what matters is what you see when you're here." That became my anchor. I couldn't erase every seed of doubt she planted, but I could water the truth with consistency, with presence. Every meal cooked, every story told, every laugh shared. It was all proof no false evidence could overwrite. Still, I kept the messages she sent, documented everything. I wasn't naive enough to believe she'd stop at words. The last time she had fabricated evidence. If she tried again, I wanted to be ready. This wasn't about revenge, it was about making sure the family didn't fracture again under her schemes. And in the middle of all this, I found myself reflecting on what forgiveness meant. People always talk about letting go, moving on, forgiving for your own peace. But how do you forgive someone who continues to sharpen their knife? I realized forgiveness doesn't mean letting her back in. It meant refusing to let her control the narrative of my life. So I lived differently. I stopped hiding my thoughts, stopped trying to protect everyone by keeping my fears to myself. When I felt uneasy, I told my son. When I worried about the children, I said it plainly. And in return, he opened up more than before. Slowly, honesty became our armor. One night, while locking the front door, I paused. The house was quiet, warm, filled with signs of life again. For the first time in years, I felt the balance tilting, not toward her lies, but toward the truth we were building day by day. It didn't erase the past, but it gave me strength for whatever might come next. I kept telling myself we were moving forward, but the truth had a way of slipping back into the room when least expected. Just when I thought the storm had passed, it started again. This time, with strangers knocking at my door. It was a Saturday morning when two men showed up, one holding a clipboard, the other standing slightly behind him, like backup. They introduced themselves as part of a housing inspection team, claiming they'd received a report about unsafe conditions at my property. I knew right away where this had come from. There hadn't been a single problem with the house in years, but suddenly, a complaint had been filed. My stomach sank as I realized she had found a new way to pull me into another mess. This wasn't about the house. It was about building a paper trail, something she could twist into evidence later. I let them inside, calm on the surface, though every step they took across the floorboards reminded me of how far she was willing to go. They looked over the rooms, checked the basement, even asked questions about who lived here and how often. It was professional on their part, but I could feel the undertone. They weren't just here to check wiring or pipes. Someone had fed them a narrative, and they were looking for confirmation. When they finally left, one of them turned back at the door and said, "If anyone else makes a complaint, we'll have to follow up." His words were polite, but the message was clear. She had opened another front, and this was only the beginning. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at the paperwork they'd handed me. It wasn't damning, but it was enough to remind me that her reach extended beyond whispers and texts now. She was trying to involve outsiders, to build a picture of me as someone unfit. I thought of the children, how this could affect custody, how it might give her leverage. When my son arrived later with the kids, I debated whether to tell him. Part of me wanted to shield him again, but then I remembered the vow I'd made. No more secrets. So I explained everything. He listened quietly, his jaw tightening, then finally said, "She's not going to stop until she burns everything down." That night, I lay awake and thought about the difference between defending yourself and living under siege. Defending yourself is standing up when attacked. Living under siege is knowing the attack could come at any moment, from any direction. That was where we were now. I began documenting everything in more detail. Dates, times, copies of letters, names of officials. Not because I wanted to live buried in paperwork, but because I knew she thrived in the shadows of uncertainty. If I kept a clear record, I could shine a light on whatever she tried next. And she didn't disappoint. A week later, a neighbor mentioned that she had been seen talking to people on the street about me, hinting at things that weren't true. She was spreading stories in the open now, not just through mess, ages, or legal filings. It was designed to chip away at my reputation in the community, to make me look like the problem. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I had lived here for decades, built trust with neighbors, helped them shovel snow in the winter, shared meals in the summer, and now, because of her, some of them were looking at me with quiet suspicion. I realized then that this wasn't just about family anymore. It was about survival of my name, my standing. When lies creep into the wider world, they take on a life of their own, and no judge or piece of evidence can fully erase them. But here's the part I didn't expect. Some neighbors didn't believe her. One woman came by with cookies and said, "I know what she's saying, but I also know you. Don't let it get to you." That simple act reminded me that truth has a way of leaving its own trail, just as lies do. People who had seen me live day to day weren't so quick to buy into her narrative. Still, I prepared. I spoke to a lawyer again, not because I wanted another battle, but because I couldn't afford to be blindsided. The lawyer nodded as I explained, then said, "You're right to keep records. She's escalating. If she pushes this into another legal space, the documentation could make the difference." Leaving that office, I felt the weight of it all pressing down. At my age, I should have been enjoying the quiet, watching my grandchildren grow, passing on stories, sitting in peace. Instead, I was rehearsing defenses, strategizing against someone who couldn't let go. And yet there was a strange strength in it, too. Every move she made forced me to become sharper, clearer, more open with my family. It wasn't the life I would have chosen, but it was the fight I'd been given, and I was determined not to lose myself in it. That evening, while watching the children play in the yard, I thought about how cycles either continue or break. She wanted to pull us into a cycle of bitterness, accusation, and endless retaliation. But standing there, I realized I had a choice. I could keep reacting, or I could build something steadier, something her chaos couldn't destroy. Maybe that was the real lesson buried in all this. Battles are fought in courtrooms, in houses, in neighborhoods, but the war is inside you. Whether you let someone's lies define your days or whether you live in a way that makes the truth impossible to deny. I thought the neighbor's kindness had bought me a little breathing room, but peace never lasted long in this fight. Just as I began to steady myself, another envelope slid through my door. This time it wasn't from housing inspectors or lawyers. It was a formal notice from the city about a zoning violation. I stood there staring at the letter, reading it twice, then a third time. According to the notice, my garage had been reported as an illegal rental space. It was laughable. I had never rented it out, never even thought about it. The place was full of tools, old furniture, and boxes I hadn't touched in years. But the city didn't care about that. A complaint had been filed, and now I was the one forced to prove a negative. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just trying to beat me in one arena. She was trying to exhaust me, to drown me in so many small battles that I would eventually break under the weight of them. It wasn't about winning clean. It was about wearing me down. My first instinct was anger, but anger burns out quickly. What lasts is the slow grind of paperwork, deadlines, and meetings with people who don't know you but hold power over your life. That's time. A battlefield she had chosen, and it was one where every mistake could cost me dearly. I decided to handle it differently this time. Instead of reacting with panic, I invited the inspector over myself. When he arrived, I opened the garage door wide. Dust floated through the sunlight, revealing nothing more than clutter and forgotten items. The inspector looked around for 5 minutes, then shook his head. "This isn't a rental. I'll clear it." I could have celebrated, but the victory felt small. For every false claim I cleared, I knew she'd invent another. The question was, how far would she go, and how long could I keep pushing back? That night, I spoke with my son again. He looked tired, older than his years, and I could see how this was wearing on him too. He said something I'll never forget. "Dad, she's trying to make you feel like you're living under her permission. Don't give her that satisfaction." His words stayed with me. Living under her permission, that was exactly it. Every knock on the door, every notice in the mail was meant to remind me that she still had a say in my life, and that was something I couldn't allow. I started taking small steps to reclaim control. I installed a camera near the front door, not because I expected trouble, but because I wanted to know who came and went. I reached out to neighbors directly, explaining what was happening instead of letting rumors fill the space. Some nodded quietly, others offered support, but at least they heard my side from me. Weeks passed, and strangely nothing new arrived. No letters, no officials, no gossip floating back to me. At first I thought maybe she had run out of steam, but then I remembered. Silence wasn't her style. If things were quiet, it was only because she was preparing something bigger. The waiting was almost worse than the battles themselves. It's one thing to fight. It's another to sit at the table every morning with your coffee and wonder what storm is brewing just beyond the horizon. And then the storm came. One afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer. His voice was steady, but the words carried weight. "She's filed for an emergency custody hearing." My stomach tightened. This wasn't about zoning laws or inspections anymore. This was about the children. I sat in silence as he explained the details. She was claiming the environment here was unsafe, pointing to the inspection visits, the supposed zoning issues, even the neighborhood whispers. Suddenly, I saw the pattern. Every false claim, every rumor, every complaint, it was never random. She had been stacking them like bricks, building a case in the shadows. For a moment, I felt crushed. All my careful notes, all the small wins, suddenly seemed fragile against the image she was trying to create. But then something steadier rose up in me. If she wanted to bring this fight into the light, then fine. At least now it would be on record, not whispered in the dark. That night, as the children played in the living room, I watched them closely. Their laughter, their small arguments over toys, their unguarded joy. It was everything she couldn't fake. And I realized something important. Lies are loud, but truth has a quiet endurance. The hearing was still weeks away, but I knew the path ahead had shifted. This wasn't about small battles anymore. This was about the core of our family. And if she wanted to test my strength there, she was going to see exactly how much I had left. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I wanted. Every morning leading up to it, I would wake before the alarm, sit at the kitchen table, and stare at the stack of papers my lawyer had prepared. Each page was a reminder that I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was defending the home my children knew. Walking into the courthouse felt different than any other fight so far. This wasn't about inspectors or zoning officials. This was a room where a single decision could shape the future of the children I loved more than anything. The air inside was cool, but my palms were damp. My son placed a hand on my shoulder before we went inside. His eyes told me everything. Be steady. Don't let her see you break. When the judge entered, the room hushed. Her presence carried weight, not because she raised her voice, but because every eye turned toward her. She opened the session by asking my former daughter-in-law's lawyer to present the case. He painted a picture that almost didn't sound like my life. According to him, my house was a place of constant inspections, unsafe conditions, and whispered doubts from neighbors. He leaned on the word unstable, repeating it like a drumbeat, as though saying it enough times would make it true. I sat there, listening, and forced myself not to react. My lawyer had warned me, the judge will be watching you just as much as she listens to the testimony. Stay composed. Let the evidence speak. Then she took the stand. Her voice was calm, carefully measured, but I could hear the practiced edges. She described me as unfit, overwhelmed, and resistant to guidance. At one point, she even claimed the children themselves had expressed fear in my home. That last part nearly made me speak out, but I gripped the table instead. I knew my lawyer would address it. When it was our turn, my lawyer began by laying out a timeline. He showed the judge how every complaint she filed had been investigated and dismissed. He presented documents from the city clearing me of zoning violations. He showed the inspector's written report that the garage was nothing more than storage. Piece by piece, the false bricks she had stacked crumbled. Then came the moment that mattered most. My lawyer called me to testify. I stood, straightened my jacket, and walked to the stand. For a second, I looked at my children sitting quietly with a court officer. Their small faces reminded me why I couldn't falter. I spoke about my home, not as a defendant trying to win a case, but as a grandfather who knew what stability meant. I explained the inspections, the rumors, the endless notices, and how I handled each one with transparency. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply laid out the truth. The judge listened closely, occasionally taking notes. When my lawyer asked how the children were doing with me, I described their routines, the breakfasts before school, the evenings spent on homework, the weekends when we visited the park. I could see the judge's eyes soften slightly when I spoke about reading to them at night. Cross-examination was harsher. Her lawyer tried to twist my words, pressing me on whether I ever felt overwhelmed. I admitted I did, because who wouldn't under so much pressure? But then I added, feeling the weight of responsibility isn't the same as failing to carry it. That line came out of me without rehearsal, and for the first time, I saw her lawyer hesitate. After testimony closed, the judge called a brief recess. I stepped outside, the air thick with tension. My son walked beside me, silent at first, then finally said, "You did good, Dad. Really good." Hearing that from him steadied me more than anything else could have. When we returned, the judge gave her decision. She didn't drag it out with long speeches. She simply said the evidence didn't support the claims of instability. Custody would remain unchanged. Then she looked directly at my former daughter-in-law, and added a warning. This court is not a weapon. If false claims continue, consequences will follow. The room went silent. My former daughter-in-law's face tightened, but she said nothing. For the first time, it felt like someone with real authority had called her out. Walking out of that courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, yes, but also clearer than I had in months. The fight wasn't over. People like her rarely walk away quietly, but I had held my ground in the one place where truth mattered most. And for now, that was enough. After the ruling, I thought maybe things would settle, at least for a while. The judge's warning had been clear. Anyone with sense would have taken it as a signal to stop. But people like her don't retreat. They regroup. For a few weeks, life almost felt normal. The kids were back to their routines: school in the morning, chatter at the dinner table, evenings with homework spread across the living room floor. Sometimes they would fall asleep before finishing, and I'd carry them to bed, whispering promises that tomorrow would be easier. But even in those small moments of calm, I kept one ear tuned to the phone. Every time it rang, I braced myself for another summons or notice. My son noticed too. He'd say, "Dad, relax. You won. She can't keep pulling the same tricks." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew she wasn't done. The first sign came quietly. A letter from her lawyer arrived, claiming she intended to appeal the custody ruling. My lawyer told me not to worry. Appeals required grounds, and she had none. Still, the word itself was enough to twist my stomach. An appeal meant more time, more fees, more dragging the children into courtrooms and waiting rooms. Not long after, whispers started again in the neighborhood. This time, the talk wasn't about the garage or the house itself. It was about me. Someone had told people at the school that I was too frail to handle 2 children, that I left them unsupervised. By the time the rumor reached me, it had grown into a story that I spent whole days asleep while the kids fended for themselves. I asked the principal directly if anyone had raised concerns. She assured me the children were doing fine, that their attendance and grades spoke for themselves. But I could see it in her eyes. Someone had gotten to her. Someone wanted her watching more closely, waiting for a slip. One evening, my daughter sat across the table poking at her food. Finally, she looked up and asked, "Grandpa, why do people say you can't take care of us?" My heart sank. She wasn't supposed to carry that weight. I told her the truth, that sometimes people tell stories to get what they want, and that it doesn't make the stories real. She nodded, but I could see the doubt working its way into her young mind. That was the hardest part, watching the fight spill into their world. When I told my lawyer about the new rumors, he sighed. This is what she does. When the legal route stalls, she turns to the court of public opinion. You can't chase down every whisper. Just keep steady. Document everything. He was right, but it didn't make the nights any easier. My son wanted to confront her directly. He said, "Enough is enough. She's tearing the kids apart just to get at you." But I told him not to. Confrontation would only feed her fire, give her more to twist into another accusation. We had to be patient, no matter how unfair it felt. The real turning point came when a social worker knocked at my door one afternoon. Someone had filed an anonymous report claiming neglect. The worker was polite, professional, but the visit left me shaken. She asked to see the house, check the children's rooms, open the fridge. She asked questions about meals, about its bedtime, about who handled doctor appointments. When she left, she assured me she saw no issues and would close the file. Still, the fact that she had come at all told me everything I needed to know. My former daughter-in-law wasn't finished, not by a long shot. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same spot where I had studied the court papers weeks earlier. Only this time, I wasn't just thinking about defense. I was thinking about offense. If she was willing to weaponize rumors, lawyers, and even anonymous hotlines, then waiting for her next move would only exhaust us. I had to find a way to end the cycle before it swallowed the children whole. The question was how. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to drag her through the mud, even if she deserved it. What I wanted was peace, for the kids, for my son, for myself. But peace wouldn't come on its own. It would have to be fought for in a different way, one that didn't just answer her accusations, but cut off her ability to keep making them. That realization was both terrifying and clarifying. For months, I had been reacting to her strikes, always one step behind. Now, for the first time, I began to think about what it would mean to take control of the story instead of being trapped inside hers. And as much as I hated the thought, I knew that meant facing her again, not in anger, but with strategy. There comes a moment when you stop asking for respect and start living in a way that commands it. I learned that dignity isn't something others hand to you, it's something you decide not to let anyone take away. No matter how many times they tried to belittle me or treat me as if my worth expired with age, I found strength in reminding myself that my value was written long before their judgments. And maybe that's the real lesson here. You can choose to accept the role they force on you, or you can reclaim the script and show them that every line still belongs to you. But if you think this story ends here, you'd be wrong, because just when I thought the worst betrayal was behind me, another moment came along that tested me in ways I never imagined. It happened on a day that was supposed to be filled with celebration. Instead, it turned into something else entirely, and how I responded might surprise you.